Hello, today is August 26th. I want to do a little sort of focus on what's transpired in the last month or so. And then the next Ollie will be on September 30th, which will be the first of the fall-winter season, and then we'll be going every 2 weeks. So this morning in the mail, 10 minutes ago, the US mail arrived. The journal Foreign Affairs arrived. And the title for the whole edition is America Adrift. And then the titles of the articles are The Perils of Isolationism, Losing the Wars of the Future, Trouble with Allies, and The Autocratic Allure. All of these are, no doubt, will be interesting articles to read. As I said, I haven't read them yet, but it pretty much does set the table and the agenda for what I want to talk about today, which is now that we have Harris as the presidential candidate, and you've probably heard some of the convention or saw some of the convention. The question is, now what, and what can we expect from her foreign policy, and maybe what we should expect from her foreign policy. Now, the first problem that she has is that she's still a vice president in the Biden administration, and she can't really enunciate radically different policies, even if she would like to, or refocus the current foreign policy agenda, because she has to continue to be a loyal vice president. So then all she can do at the moment is sort of around the edges, and I will demonstrate this in a minute, indicate some slightly different focus, or maybe even a different focus, and maybe some new priorities or something of that sort. But she has to be contained by the current administration, which of course is a problem for her because people are screaming, well, her speech at the convention was great, but it was short on detail. And it is true that it was short on detail. And it is also true that some of the details of what she has in mind need to be spelled out in the next, whatever it is, 70 days. But she has to be fairly careful and fairly conservative in what she spells out to make sure that it does not contradict the current policy of the current administration that she's part of. So we need to remember that, in a sense, give her a little rope in navigating this. So the first thing, of course, she's going to be confronted with is the mess in the Middle East. And there she has taken a slight step off the center from Biden by emphasizing the horrors of the situation in Gaza. And she can't really do terribly much more because she has to be committed to the support of Israel, the wholehearted support of Israel, and the sort of lack of criticism up until very recently of the Biden administration of Netanyahu's policies and unwillingness to, compromise and find a reasonable solution to stopping the slaughter and killing and decimation of Gaza and the Gazans. So even the Biden administration has begun to make slight noises saying that, the situation in Gaza is dire and some kind of halt to the conflict, maybe permanent halt from the perspective of America, and from the perspective of Israel, only a very short-term halt, and from the perspective of Hamas, a long-term and permanent halt. So there are differences, and she can sort of slither amongst those a little bit and go slightly off-center from the Biden administration. What she can do in Middle East is to address something that's related to the Palestinian and Gaza situation, but has had very little comment from the Biden administration, which is, what about the West Bank? Because while most of us haven't been looking, Even the press hasn't been looking very much. Situation in the West Bank has been absolutely deteriorating and is quite horrifying. Deteriorating how? Several hundred, probably somewhere between 400 and 500, depending on who you ask. Palestinians in Gaza have been killed, mostly by the military from Israel. In addition, more thousands have been jailed. And furthermore, the conditions of the thousands of Palestinians that have been imprisoned, for a long time and are newly imprisoned, apparently prison conditions have badly deteriorated. And the various human rights organizations point out that actually serious violations in terms of torture and so forth have been going on in the last few months, or since the Gaza situation. You will recall that the minister in the Netanyahu government who officiates over the West Bank is the most extreme right-winger who is on the public record saying all the Palestinians should be killed. And so the conditions in the West Bank have very badly deteriorated under his auspices and since the Gazan conflict has arisen. In addition, the ultra-conservative settlers on the West Bank, who under the best of circumstances would present a problem for how you create a two-state solution somewhere down the road, have been expanding. And they've been expanding by unilaterally, or at least with the support of this minister, have been grabbing land from the Palestinians. So, for example, they have moved into several olive farms, simply which have been run and managed by Palestinians in some cases for generations. And have essentially ousted the Palestinians owners of the olive farms and taken over the land. And they are busily expanding settlements in the West Bank, while the rest of us aren't looking very much to make sure to maximize their control over the West Bank. So a president candidate, Harris, could actually focus in on and say a lot about what's happening in the West Bank, which more or less the Biden administration has not touched very publicly, because, of course, it's a criticism of Netanyahu and his administration. And so she can sort of say, I don't want to get to the middle of the Gaza negotiations, which my current administration is dealing with, but I do want to address the horrendous situation in humanitarian situation in Gaza and say more about this. She even did that in her address to the convention, but then more sharply focus on and expose what is going on in the West Bank. Then the other area where she has spoken up a little, where she can speak up more, is while all of this is going on, the Biden administration announced $5 billion of additional military assistance in the next few years to Israel. And since those things are not being delivered to deal with the current conflict, but long term, she can certainly say that depending on what is going to happen inside Israel politically and in the region and various negotiations with other Arab countries, North African countries, and so on, that should be re-examined. That much I think she would be able to get away with. In any event, she has to be very careful, is I guess what I'm saying, and for especially progressives to keep saying she has to, come out fighting on all of these issues, which I understand why progressives are saying that, but she has to be very cautious because, as I said, she's playing a dual role, vice president of the current administration and hopefully future president. Let me also say a few other things about the Middle East. She can address again the pre-Israeli Gazan conflict developments that were, brought in Saudi Arabia and other countries to create a more peaceful circumstance. And in a sense, in that part of the world, and in a sense, to kind of support the idea that the states ought to get together to create an environment in that part of the world conducive to their economic development and political stability, and at the time make some noises with respect to Iran. You will notice that Iran has been in the news recently because Iran is going to respond either directly or indirectly through whether it's Hamas or whether it's other Sunni states in the region. I'm sorry, I mean Hezbollah and other Sunni states in the region. Who are serving as surrogates, right, for the Iranians. And the Iranians have been really quite conservative in terms of their response. Now, this might get more serious, and of course, a nuclear conflict in the region is still possible. But that's the relationship with Iran. She, I think, is in a position to say something, especially because we got out of the nuclear agreement with Iran under the Trump administration, and she can obviously argue that the various countries that were part of that particular arrangement should reconsider and renegotiate with Iran to possibly reach a new arrangement. That might be hard to do, but she certainly can say some things about this issue. In the meantime, of course, we have driven Iran into the hands of Russia, right? Because the sanctions that have been applied to Iran have made it essentially impossible for it not to align itself, both militarily and economically, with Russia and other like-minded allies of Russia. And there, too, it seems to me, of Harris' foreign policy could say something about the fact that sanctions against Iran have to be re-examined. That gets me on the general subject of sanctions. I would argue that the idea of punishing states right, left, and center through economic sanctions has been by and large an unsuccessful policy. And one could argue that occasionally economic sanctions for domestic economic and political reasons might be justified. But one can also point to the example of Iran, for example, that sanctioning a country so that essentially it is not viable economically is bound to have negative consequences, either to drive them to make alliances that one wished they didn't make, for example, Iran and Russia, and or dependencies with countries one wished they also wouldn't become interdependent with. So again, she would be in a position to say something about sanctions. Then, there are more things to be said about the Middle East, but essentially, the Harris administration confronts what the Biden administration has already confronted, but she can probably say some slightly more creative things about it, is that of that almost 200 countries in the world, half are authoritarian, have autocrats running them one way or another. And of course, if one wants to be a major country in the world and have big influence, one therefore has to deal with autocrats as well as with others when on a necessary and desirable basis. Now, I'm not suggesting Biden administration isn't doing that to some extent. For example, the negotiations over Gaza brings in, countries like Egypt and other countries that have autocrats. But it is a task for the next president to, on the one hand, support democracy wherever it's possible and wherever it already exists, and at the same time be fairly pragmatic in dealing with other countries whenever it's desirable and necessary. There is, of course, because of the Ukraine situation, which she may or may not be able to influence down the road. That's a very shaky situation at the moment. But besides the Ukraine situation, there's a whole world out there, much of which is actually not being addressed because the Biden administration is so consumed with, on the one hand, the Middle East, on the other hand, the Ukraine, and on the other hand, of course, China. She apparently is going to be going to China, and certainly having a pragmatic relationship with China makes sense, and in that sense would be a continuity from the Biden administration. But there's lots of stuff in the world that is not getting enough attention. For example, what's happening in Venezuela, where an election outcome has been denied and Maduro is claiming that he's still in power. For example, we can have a better Cuba policy. The fact that the Biden administration continued the Trump administration more or less in Cuba, I think can be argued is a mistake, was a mistake, and could be remedied. There are all kinds of things happening in Latin America which are not getting very much attention, and her administration should pay and could pay more attention to that part of the world. After all, it's in our backyard. But there are also interesting things going on in Asia, which could also be an agenda that she could actually talk about even now, because the Biden administration hasn't really talked about it. For example, interesting stuff is going on in Bangladesh. You say, well, Bangladesh, who cares about Bangladesh? It's far away. Bangladesh, by the way, has about somewhere between 170 and 190 million people. It's a large country. And furthermore, Bangladesh is the workshop for much of the clothing that gets imported by the United States. Sometimes the companies are Chinese or others, but in any event, look at our labels sometime, how much of it comes from Bangladesh. So Bangladesh is a very large country. It's a very big country. The woman who became a dictator of Bangladesh has withdrawn, has been ousted in a sense. And you now have a temporary government in Bangladesh headed by the Pulitzer Prize winning Yunus, who started, the small banks, loans for small farmers, etc., who is a world figure. He's quite old. He's in his 80s. But he is, respected around the world. He will probably not be there for very long. They have to form a government. But in any event, while he's there, he is an entree for Harris to sort of say, let us help. What can we do? Communicate with us. We're very interested in seeing Bangladesh become a democracy again, etc. So there are things that can be done there. Ditto Vietnam, which is still a communist country, but now has a new leader. It's too late for Biden administration to make direct contact with him very much. She could take the initiative. The situation in Indonesia is quite shaky. The newly elected government is an ex-general with human rights violations who might very well become quite autocratic. and his vice president is the current son of the son of the current president. So the whole political situation, what direction Indonesia will take and so forth, is also quite open. And she would have the possibility to make some linkages into Indonesia. So what I'm saying, in a sense, is that there are, on the one hand, opportunities for her to step right, slightly off center from the current Biden policy. There is an opportunity for her to address issues that have gone gray. They haven't gotten a lot of attention recently in the Biden administration. There are possibilities for issues like Bangladesh, which are newly at play in terms of their future politics and so forth. So it seems to me she can go into some of these gray areas and into some of these gaps and say something relatively more specific than the generalities for which she has been criticized at the convention. Now, what is her experience in foreign policy? Not a whole lot. I mean, she has visited a number of countries as vice president. The comment the accusation, let us say, that Trump makes to her about the whole immigration situation, she was actually sent to Central American countries to talk to them about how to slow the emigration of people. And there is a new government coming in Mexico. She has an opportunity, who's a woman, by the way, first woman in Mexico, and she has an opportunity to get to know her right now and have some communications with her, so that she's actually in a good position to do some outreach. And of course, what a Harris administration would look like in terms of foreign policy will also depend a lot on who becomes Secretary of State and Defense and so forth. Very often when the president, newly elected president, is less experience in foreign policy, which, by the way, Obama was as well, and so have been others, they have to lean on the State Department and on the CIA and so forth. So she can obviously do a lot of spade work while she's treading water a little bit in terms of seeing what an administration would look like if she became elected. In the meantime, of course, she's getting attacked by Trump, and God knows Trump could still win the election. And he tells, all kinds of untruths, which you know about, which I won't summarize here, about her. But she needs surrogates, right, to speak up in terms of, she's not dumb and all the other accusations that Trump is making of her. There's one interesting aside that I just want to cover, and that is her president, Walz, is, of course, a counter to her, right? Deeply embedded, small town Middle West. And, we all know about he was a coach and a teacher and all those good things. So superficially, it looks like he has no foreign policy experience, which in a sense is with bad. It's good to have a president who also has foreign policy experience, but also is slightly not true. And here's an interesting thing which some of you may know, and that is that he went to China for a year when he was relatively young to go teach there. And if I'm not mistaken, he was there during fairly shaky political times. And then subsequently, he and his wife, I believe, went to China 30 times. So they're kind of China junkies. I don't know that they speak Chinese, But it is the case that they have lived in a different culture and that they have sort of fairly warm and fuzzy feelings about China, though in recent times he has made critical comments about, Chinese policy, along with other Democrats and others. So he doesn't seem to be simple-minded about it. But certainly the fact that he has overseas experience and presumably has a sensitivity to respect other cultures, and to learn from other cultures, and to sort of have this sort of with some Chinese and some knowledge of Chinese can't be a bad thing. And I would say was quite unexpected if you looked at his CV and all the descriptions. So, what can one say about her and foreign policy? Relatively unexperienced, but the accusation that she hasn't said very much about details of domestic and foreign policy, I would say that she has to be very careful on both scores, because she is still a vice president who can't just object to the current administration's policy. What she can do is expand, add to, suggest slightly different directions for the future, but she has to be diplomatic and she has to be careful. And then she, I think, needs to probably spend some time with at least the Democratic members of the foreign affairs committees of Senate and Congress, and make linkages with them in case she's lucky enough to win as a future president. Ditto security committees and so forth. Obviously, in the House, they are chaired by Republicans, but it seems to me that some work with Congress is also possible for her to engage in. In any event, we're all going to go through, a ride. And for those of you who want her to become president, there isn't terribly much we can do in California, which will go Democratic, but some of you are capable to go to other states that could use some campaign workers. And in the meantime, we could all, those of us who want to not see another Trump administration, can cross our fingers that she might slither into the presidency. Thank you very much. And as I said, I will see you again on September 30th.